Welcome, everyone. My name is Henry Lusengore, and I am the CEO of Promoting Economic Pluralism and the editor of the Mint magazine, um, the magazine we create. And you can see the logo on my virtual background. And we have regular meetings, regular webinars now, monthly, on a range of topics. And of course, at the moment, like everyone else, we're tending to look for ones that are relevant to the current context. And many of you might have seen this morning lots of commentary on who is being sent back to work, in what conditions, and who isn't. So obviously the topic of the differential impacts of COVID-19 are right at the forefront of the news, and we're very lucky to have two great people to talk to us this evening. Firstly, Ben Tippett. He's an educator, activist, and writer. He's doing a PhD at the University of Greenwich at the moment, and is already the author of the book Split, which is part of Pluto Press's new Outspoken series, a series of punchy, passionate political books written by young people for young people. But I'm sure it's okay for older people to read it too. And obviously this evening, I think we have a range of young, old, and so forth. Then we have, to follow that, Wanda Wyporska, who is Executive Director at the Equality Trust. That's the national charity that campaigns to reduce social and economic inequality. So the major NGO in this space. She also does a range of other things, such as research at the University of York, and she is a regular keynote speaker, so we're very lucky to get her. Part of set up the Fight Inequality Alliance, and she's got a lot of experience working in the trade union movement, leading on equality, social mobility, education policy, and more. So she's incredibly knowledgeable in this space, and we're very lucky to have her. So we're going to start with Ben Tippett. I'm going to unmute him and pin his video. It's better if everyone views this as, so he's the speaker, so you can see as much of him as possible. And he's going to give a sort of overview of his work and his book. After that, we're going to have breakouts where people have a chance to discuss their responses, what they think of it, what questions arise for them, and also, of course, introduce each other. We'll then come back for a plenary and take questions, comments, and get responses from both Ben and Vonda. Then we'll go into the next session. We're breaking this up into two bits, really, and look specifically at how COVID-19 has bared the deep inequalities to a wider audience, if you like, because often they're hidden, but they have, I think, been on the news in a way that they haven't in the past, and what potential there is to actually take action, address these inequalities, given the way they've been highlighted over this current period. So with that, I'll hand over to Ben to start us off. Thanks very much, Ben.
Great. Thanks, Henry. Thanks for inviting me as well, and for all your work, to be honest, as such a kind of campaigner in the economic pluralism movement. I think I've known Henry for a few years because I've been involved with doing some stuff around promoting different ways of thinking and new ways of thinking within economics. And I know Henry does a lot of stuff in that, so thanks for that. So yeah, as Henry said, my book Split, Class Divide Uncovered, I wrote the book, I guess, to tell the story of economic inequality in this country in an accessible way, a way that's driven by a narrative, with stories, with cultural references. And in a way, the book is an attempt to do that. You know, I'd hope you'd be able to give this book to kind of anyone of any age, I guess, even though it is marketed at young people, but also, you know, anyone of any different types of background or expertise. You don't need to necessarily have an economics degree or any degree really to read it. Now, I guess to give an overview of the main argument of the book, I'm going to actually borrow a statistic which I took from the Equality Trust, so from the work that Wanda does, because I think that's a great resource. And you know, statistics can be a bit dry, but I think this statistic really encapsulates the central message of my book, which is that, you know, class and class inequality deeply matters for all of our lives. And what you kind of see is that obviously at the moment, you know, we're living through a process where we're kind of coming up to the second unprecedented crisis in a generation. The first one for me, at least, was in 2008, you know, and even after that, we were told, you know, oh, this only happens once in 70 years. But basically throughout the whole of my adult lifetime now, we'll have a situation where our economy will be defined by these crises. And what we see between 2008 and today is a extreme widening of economic inequality in this country. So the statistic is, if you look at the richest 1,000 families, which is given by the Sunday Times Rich List, they have nearly tripled their wealth since 2008 and today. And now they own much more wealth than I think even the bottom 40% of the British population. And you know, this kind of poses a question. How did the rich get wealthy? And I think, you know, from mainstream economists to politicians, we've been told that the wealthiest people in society are there because they're the most, you know, they deserve to be there. They're the most productive, they're the most hardworking, they come up with the best ideas, they're the most intelligent. You know, they've given us great companies like Facebook, like Zoom, let's say. I don't actually know who owns Zoom, but they're probably quick to becoming a billionaire. Bezos giving us Amazon, you know, allowing us to shop without getting out of bed. You know, we've been told that the wealthier that they get, the wealthier we become. Or the other kind of phrases, trickle-down economics, or, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. But what you see between 2008 and today is that actually, for most of us, we haven't got rich. You know, the wealth hasn't trickled down. And so if we take, I think probably the best indicator of this, if we look at average wages in the economy, so this is the average wages across the private sector and the public sector, these have completely stagnated from 2008 to today, to basically just before the crisis. In fact, the average wages only returned to their pre-2008 levels in February of this year. And then now with the COVID crisis, what we're going to see is probably another 12 years, if not longer, of similar wage decline, or you know, wage stagnation, unless something different happens, unless the class relationships in the UK change. And I think we see that clearly. I don't want to dwell too much on the COVID stuff because I know Vanda's going to talk about it, but you know, the report that was you know, released by the Treasury to kind of test the waters of around austerity yesterday that threatened a public sector pay freeze. Now, I bring up wealth and I bring up wages because I think this talks about one of the fundamental class divides and one of the fundamental drivers of inequality in our society, which is the difference between capital and labor. Maybe a neat way of thinking about it is from a phrase from the billionaire Warren Buffett. So he's the third richest man in the world. And he says, you know, we live in a society in which either you work till you die or you make money while you sleep. And I think that just neatly encapsulates actually how, in a very sinister way, how the capitalist system kind of functions. And I think class starts with this divide. You know, the reason why some people can make money while they sleep is because other people have to work till they die. And this book is a way of trying to tell this story in an accessible way. Now, obviously, this isn't the only divide or the only inequality that matters in society. I think that throughout the book, each chapter, I look at how this relates to other aspects of our lives, like work, gender, race, the environment, housing, and the government and the state, which is again becoming increasingly important. You know, who does the state work for? But I think what we need to remember is that even though, you know, we have such an obvious inequality at the heart of our system, the analysis of class has actually kind of fallen off of the mainstream agenda. You know, class has been this kind of very, I think, quite an overlooked concept in mainstream politics and culture, or it's actually even been a mocked concept, I'd say, in mainstream politics and culture. So, and you know, even if it has come in, I think it's been largely defined along cultural lines, you know, with the key divide being the liberal metropolitan elite versus a kind of traditional, authentic working class. Now, I think this discussion of class has hidden the daylight robbery that's going on. I want to kind of bring up another quote from Warren Buffett, because I think this neatly summarizes again what's been happening. He says, you know, there's a class warfare going on, but it's my class, the rich class, that's been waging the war, and we're winning. And so we need to understand, like, how, you know, how this has been happened. Why, how has this war been waged? How have the rich been allowed to win it? And I think most importantly, how do we fight back? Henry, how much longer do I have? Oh, you're muted.
4 minutes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so that's good. So I wasn't sure how long I'd take. So why don't we talk about maybe two of these changes that have happened? I guess we can call them two fights, you know, in this war. And I think one has been the fight over our time, and the other has been the fight over our houses. And I bring these up because I think this is really you know, the legacy of these of the fights over these two things is deeply related to the COVID crisis, and I hope Wanda will talk about that. So the fight over our time, you know, the fundamental thing about capital and labor really is based on the workplace, is based, and what is work when we really think about it? Work is, at the end of the day, people having to sell, you know, people effectively having to get the things that they need to survive, like you know, housing, water, food, shelter, warmth, heating. None of these things come free in our society. You have to pay for them, and sometimes they have quite a big price tag. And so the only way in which most of us have any ability to pay for them is if we sell our time in order to earn a wage. But the kind of that relationship, that exchange between selling your time for a wage, this is something that has, you know, changed massively over you know, history. It's shaped by many different factors. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is that this exchange is becoming deeply unequal. The amount of wages that you get back for your time, as I said, has stagnated. And this has led to a huge rise in in-work poverty. In fact, in-work poverty is at the highest it's been in 20 years. And you're much more likely to be in poverty and working than in poverty and not working and on the dole. So in this sense, work isn't working. And there's another way in which work relates to time. You know, it's not so much that we're working kind of too much for a small wage. It's also this idea that there's so much flexibility within the workplace now. You don't even have a certainty about when you might be working. And this is kind of encapsulated in the precarious work that we've become so familiar with. You know, the increase in 0-hour contracts, the huge numbers of the British workforce who are working in insecure, low-paid work. In the book, I cite a report that says 1 in 6 workers in the UK economy are in insecure, low-paid work. So this is a huge section of our population, and this has happened. You know, this hasn't happened by accident. This, I think, has happened because of the fact that organized labor has been kind of crushed in this country. I think this has been an active attempt to try and externalize a lot of the costs from the state and the ability to make profits onto ordinary people. To briefly say, maybe the other thing is about the fight over our houses. So the housing sector, you know, it's gone through huge changes over the last 30, 40 years. In the 1970s, I think around 40% of people lived in council homes. Today it's about 8%. So you've seen a huge dramatic shift from state-run housing to owner occupancy and private rental. And alongside this, what you've seen is a huge increase in this kind of buy-to-let landlordism. Buy-to-let landlordism as a term I didn't realize was only invented in the 1990s. And since then it's increased by something like 2,500%. So in this sense, and I bring that up again because what we're seeing now with the COVID crisis is a huge problem in the private rental sector, with people not being able to afford their rents, and effectively the government not really the government and also the opposition party at the moment not willing to give any kind of rent not deferrals, but getting rid of rents, allowing them to be struck off. And so maybe just the last point I want to say is how do we kind of fight back? These are two examples I go through, I guess, other ones in the book like environment and also how it relates to gender and race. And I think what we can learn from history is that the only way in which working people or renters or any of these groups can fight back is if they organize collectively as a group, and that gives them power. And so what I would say right now to everyone on the call is, regardless of even if you're working, even if you're in a job, you're unemployed, you might be furloughed, whatever work you're in, whatever kind of housing situation you're in, I would say fundamentally really join a union. Join some kind of labor union, some kind of tenants' rights unions, because unions want us weekends, unions want us sick pay, they want us labor laws, parental leave, minimum wages, health and safety laws. And actually, even what we see with the furlough scheme is that the only reason it hasn't been dropped from 80% to 60%, which is what they were originally planning to do at the beginning of the week, is because unions have put pressure on the government not to do it. So I think it's a time in which working people do actually have, in a sense, a lot of power if they can come together and organize. And so I would really say join a union. It works. It has a huge impact on the macro economy and also on your personal life. So I'd say that's the kind of take home message from this talk. I realize I'm kind of coming up to the edge of my time limit, so I'm going to stop there, but hopefully there'll be time to bring up some of the other points that I have during the discussion. But thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben. That's a great overview and a great starting point to create a context. Now, what I'd like to do now is put you all automatically into a breakout group. Once you're in it, do unmute yourselves and quickly introduce yourselves maybe. And what I'd like you to think about is, what do you think are the worst dimensions of inequality that we need to discuss? And also, what about fighting back? Do people have experience of unions or other forms of collective protest? Discuss those. And then when you come back, it'll be 10 minutes. Please be ready to ask questions, make comments, and so on. Do try to avoid jumping straight into COVID, because we'll get to that later. Sort of try to think we're about 2 months ago and the world was different, and think about that, and then we'll obviously pick up COVID later. Brilliant. Look forward to getting you back very soon. Now, I think everyone's coming back. We're just about there. We've lost a few people, but maybe they're not extended. That's strange. Okay, let's start. Who would like to start? Make a comment or question or reflection that they discussed, or just as occurred to them. If you put your, actually, could everyone put their video on? And then I can see people, and it's probably easiest people can put their hand up, and then I'll unmute you, and you can make your point. Right, Tom.
You seem to have lost a lot of people, Henry. What happened?
Sorry?
You seem to have lost a lot of people.
Well, I don't know. They didn't like the people in breakout group. Was there a fight of camera sort of thing?
Well, there were three of us in our room. There's Francesca and Jill and myself. Jill is GMR, who's shy, so she's put her camera off. Francesca seems to have disappeared. Who knows why? One thing we talked about was thinking bigger. And the number of people and the idea of unaffordable housing. And this is a UK-centric conversation, and it's a London-centric conversation, it would appear. But Help to Buy was only designed to make crony capitalism get even stronger. Right? I'm a finance guy. I was a property developer for years. It's a complete con, right? And it's the only thing we offered to try to get people into housing. Shared ownership, help to buy, etc. What if we rethought it all and actually went back to rented housing? Massive paradigm shift for Brits, but the 70% of Germans live in rented houses. They seem to be okay. So we talked about that a little bit. And Francesca, was a self-avowed millennial, was saying that life seems to be getting a lot smaller for the millennials. They live in smaller spaces. They're not starting families because they've got no space. And it's a little bit like Tokyo has been for the last 25 years. Not a lot of fun. So one of the things we were thinking about was to have a real look at housing, and move away from what the economists call the rentier class. So that's what we talked about.
Right. So a return to, well, a move to renting rather than owning. Vonda, would you like to start off? Any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that we have that comparison with the continent. And I think, we have some of the highest prices in terms of housing. We have, for those of us who lived through the 80s and the 90s, we saw that huge sell-off of council housing and the failure to replace it. But also we saw that national mantra of, we must own our own homes under Thatcher, which has done irreparable damage, because council houses have been sold off, but social housing hasn't been replaced. And this is one of the key forms of inequality. When the LSE in Case and Trust for London produced a report trying to define a riches wealth line, so to see if there's such a thing as too rich, what people thought. And the interesting thing was that wealth was talked about in terms of security. So having enough money to have a house and own a house and know that you weren't going to be moved on, know that you weren't going to be subjected to sort of 6 months and then being kicked out, was a key part for most people. So that aspiration to own a home isn't just, from the 80s. It's about having that security of knowing that you've got somewhere to live, which after all is one of the key fundamentals of human life.
So and if you're renting, you don't have that security, or you don't necessarily.
Well, it depends on the rental terms, obviously. I mean, on the continent and in different countries, there are far stronger rights for those who are renting because it's more normal. Whereas here, we've seen, much more, obviously, a lot of lobbying by landlords, and many of the MPs making these laws are landlords themselves, as we know. So the skewing of rights towards the landlord away from the renter is having a huge effect on that. People can be toughed out after 6 months. They're on very short leases a lot of the time.
Who else? Is there anyone else has experience of renting and the experience of that? Will?
Yeah. I worked in London for 6 months. I went to university in London before that, and renting's fairly horrible. I mean, a lot of the time you can be on a lodger's contract as well, and if you need to work, so be in a certain area of the capital, you don't really have a choice of whether you accept a lodger's contract or not, and that's basically where you're supposed to have a live-in landlord, but not always. Sometimes the landlord just visits occasionally to justify that contract, and it's it can be just done over email. I know lots of people who've signed a contract over email, and it just doesn't have any rights attached to it. So, just basic stuff. There's nothing you could really take them to court over when it comes to the actual quality.
Can you?
Yeah, so the whole thing is yeah. Sorry, go on.
So I was just wondering if you'd taken any steps to become part of a sort of collective to challenge the current rental system, or try to look into how you could, whether you could do anything about the terms of your tenancy.
Well, not really. I suppose it never seemed hugely. I mean, I was only working in London sort of temporarily for about 6 months, so it's something I never got around to. I do know a few people in the London Renters Union, and because I'm currently back at my childhood home in Sheffield now, so it's not a concern. But my partner's in London, so when I look for work there again, it probably will be something I will do, though I confess I don't really know what the Renters Union would do for me apart from provide information. I know there are certain things called rent strikes, which can be done, but I confess I don't really know how they work or what they're supposed to achieve, because obviously if you're in a union of workers and you're all working in the same industry and the same workspace, then the power and effect you have is fairly obvious. I don't really know how it works among renters. So,
Ben, do you think you could tell us maybe?
Yeah, sure.
What does the fight back against rental inequalities look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it takes many forms. I think at the moment, yeah, so Will mentioned the London Renters Union, which is obviously London-centric, but I think there's Acorn as well, which does more stuff across the country. At the moment, they're not really pushing for a rent strike. To answer your question, Will, a rent strike is different to a labour strike because, you know, if you just don't pay your landlord, they'll kick you out. There's no incentive for them to really do anything else. When if you don't work, you're hurting profits of the company and the company want you to come back into work. So the incentive for them is to try and meet your demands to bring you back in. Rent strikes, when they've been successful, have basically worked when people have the ability to pay. So they say, we can pay, but we're refusing to pay. And we'll only pay you if you meet these things, these demands, let's say. And there's been many successful examples of rent strikes throughout history. I think in the kind of I think even our original rental laws. So we talked a little bit about the rental laws that Thatcher got rid of in the 80s. These actually came out of rent struggles that happened in Glasgow in the beginning of the 20th century, which led then to, I think, the original Rent Acts, which gave kind of renters regulation and better rights that have obviously now been scrapped. So I think, there's a really important lesson there, that actually it is through collective organizing within housing that we've, that in the long term has enabled us to have some of those benefits. I think if you're interested, again, to the last point, because I was thinking about this as well, you don't necessarily just join a union because you're personally in a situation where you need access to the union as well. Like, I think a union is partly about, if you can, it's partly about getting information, as you said. It's about campaigning as a wider group of people so that you can support those who do need help. And it's also about giving small amounts of money a month to pay for legal fees and stuff for people who are being evicted. And so, like, I would really recommend joining the London Renters Union, even if you're not, think that you're not in a precarious housing situation, because actually, that's you then help other people. Maybe one last point is on lodgers. So there's been an eviction ban in the UK. I don't know if you guys, I'm sure have heard about it, but there's not an eviction ban for lodgers. Lodgers don't fall under that same law. This is something, again, that was highlighted by the London Renters Union. And so lots of people lodgers are being evicted. And so, again, it's just a further fragmentation of our rights within the rental sector. So maybe one demand for it's not my place to come up with demands for the rent strike, but one thing could be to try and change legislation at a local level.
So we covered housing. Just before we move on to COVID, is there anything else people want to comment or issue? Deepak.
So I'm a PhD student studying inequality and identity. And before coming into full-time education, I've been working for the past 20 years, firstly with the police and then with central government, then with local government. So I have worked in the civil service for about 20 years. And in each of my employment positions, and even for my sisters as well, my two sisters, we've always experienced some sort of racial either name calling, discrimination, or something with a racialized element. And it's always been quite destructive and marginalizing and hurtful personally. And as I say, I've always been a member of the union, but when I've approached the union about the treatment that I've received, I felt like I have had to navigate the process of making a complaint almost with blindfolded, and the representative with whom I work to make such a complaint has been none the wiser. I felt as if that the representative is just as unaware of the processes, protocols, nuances, means of circumventing deadlines and requirements are just as alien to them as they are to me. So we're both left, and me ultimately, at a great disadvantage because the persons that are mistreating us are very aware of how to navigate these laws and these regulations and protocols to their benefit, so that deadlines can be overshot, moved, and manipulated, where to the point where I'm left with no means of making a complaint because I've either overshot the deadline or the evidence that I have has been all of a sudden deleted from my email and I have no further access to it. It's just a trend, and it's really frustrating.
So the sort of inequality, both in terms of how you're treated due to your racial heritage, and also you're suggesting that the sort of rules, one side is sort of at a disadvantage because the rules are complicated, and the more powerful side have all the resources to use the rules to beat people effectively who make any complaints. Vonda, do you want to make a quick comment on that before we move on to COVID?
Yeah, thanks. And first of all, I really sympathise and empathise with everything you're saying. I understand your situation. I've been in it myself. I think there still is a lack of representation in terms of unions, in terms of women, and in terms of ethnic minorities, because their structures are also, subject to institutional racism, as most structures and institutions are. There are equality reps, and one of the asks that we had for the government was to make equality reps statutory reps and give them statutory rights, which this government hasn't done. And I think Labour have committed to do that if they come into power. But very often reps haven't, reps are volunteers, reps haven't always had the training, and it's quite difficult to access the full-time official at the union. Having said that, I have come across very, very good reps as well. So I think it sometimes can depend on the union and can depend on who's taking your case.
Tricky. I'm going to now move on because we're into the second half, and ask Vonda to start with some comments on how she feels COVID-19 has really laid bare inequalities and what opportunities there might be there for for change. Now it's become so much more obvious.
Thanks, Henry, and thanks for inviting me this evening. I'm going to go back to what Deepak said, because I think that fleshes out one of the key problems that we've seen with the over-representation of Black and minoritized ethnic people in the health service in particular, feeling that they can't say no, feeling that they can't speak up. And that is obviously related to the disproportionate number of deaths we're seeing. So what you've experienced and what you've expressed is a very real problem, and it's leading to problems on the front line that we're all too aware of. But I want to go back to the conditions that we found ourselves in before this happened, because this happens to be COVID-19. It could be anything else. It could be a different type of pandemic. It could be a different type of economic shock. It just happens to be the situation that we're in now. The conditions beforehand, after 10 years of cuts, after decades of high levels of inequality, which have had a cumulative effect on people, and not just people, on places, on industries, on a completely different way of earning a living that people are going through, have that context, because that feeds in to the disastrous situation that we find ourselves in now. So we have a very, very threadbare social security blanket. And I think what's been quite interesting is seeing a lot of people being made redundant, or people who are self-employed, people who are generally quite middle class, realizing that you're supposed to get by on around £93 a week. Now, these people weren't aware of this over the last 10 years. A whole sector, whole swathes of society, including disabled people, including unemployed people, have been trying to get by on these sums of money over the last 10 years. And, you know, there's been this lack of collective solidarity with these people, as people have sort of clung to their own nice, sort of, you know, relatively well-off lives. So we've seen that. We've seen a development of the precariat, as Ben mentioned. We've seen something that, you know, we used to see in the 40s and the 50s, the equivalent of people standing around at the edge of the street waiting to be picked up to go to work. So the platforms that the platform and gig economy that we're seeing proliferate can depend very much, again, on preferences. It gives more power to the boss. And anyone who's seen Ken Loach's film Sorry We Missed You will see that, you know, if you annoy your boss, or you don't give them sexual favors, or they just don't happen to like an Asian person, then you're not going to get the shifts. And the consequences of that are you can't pay your rent, you can't feed your family, you end up going to a food bank, you can possibly end up homeless. So that power that is being waged and being wielded by a range of people is also contributing to the huge inequalities that we see. So we have the precariat, we have lower union density than we have seen for a while. We have new forms of unions arising to work with the gig economy, and it's very, very difficult to organize workers who are very in disparate places. You know, it's not as if we have huge factories with thousands and thousands of people and we can go in and organize there as we used to. It's a much more complex landscape now. So we don't have the social security blanket. We don't have the public services that we need in order to be able to live our lives in a full and dignified way. We know that the burden of this falls predominantly on women. The House of Commons Library report found that the burden of austerity had fallen predominantly on women, up to, you know, over 70%. And behind all of this is a financialization of services. So we've seen academization, and I previously worked in an education union, and we were warning that this was a sell-off of our education system. We have the privatization by stealth of the NHS. We've had the privatization of our transport system. We've had the privatization of our utilities. So we are financializing everything we can get our hands on. Everything has to be squeezed for a profit. And this also refers back to Ben's point, whereby, you know, when we have to make sure that the shareholders are still receiving their dividends, what can be squeezed? Generally, it's wages. And that's why we've seen the longest period of wage stagnation since the Napoleonic Wars. So this is the reason I'm going into detail about this, is because when we look at inequality, we know that in countries with high levels of inequality, we also see high levels of mental and physical ill health, high levels of violence, high levels of incarceration, high levels of teenage obesity, higher levels, lower levels, of educational attainment, of social mobility, and lower levels of trust. And it's against this background that we have a pandemic. We know who the people at the bottom are. We have a gender pay gap. We have an ethnic minority pay gap. We have a disability pay gap. And we also have a class pay gap, obviously. This is the UK. So we can see those huge divides. We can see that inequality has really been at high levels for decades. It's caused this cumulative effect. It means that we have huge intergenerational differences as well. So whereas before you might be able to pass on your social housing to your kids, now you can't necessarily do that. Whereas people who, the millionaires who have their own homes are able to pass on a lot of their wealth without inheritance tax or using different ways of passing on that wealth. And this is exacerbating. I think the housing aspect and the property aspect is really, really one of the key areas of exacerbating inequality. Against that, we know that in terms of health inequalities, which are the most visible, the ones that people can really, really get hold of, that if you're born in Blackpool, if you're a man born in Blackpool, you're probably going to have around 30 years fewer healthy life expectancy than a man born in Brompton. So these health inequalities are already exacerbated by poor housing, by poor levels of education, as our education system has been stripped for profit, exacerbated by lack of access to the NHS. And so it's against this backdrop that COVID has devastated poorer and more deprived communities. And we've seen this from the ONS statistics that came out last week. And, to be honest, for those of us who are studying inequality and in this area, this is not a surprise at all. So we have this perfect storm. And I think my real worry about this, in a sense, is come October, when furlough's finished, we are going to see a lot more people joining the ranks of the unemployed. And we are already seeing the effects of COVID in terms of mental health. We're seeing the effects in terms of education. There are so many young people, there's such a divide between young people who are being educated in private schools, who more or less have 9 till 5 of education with the teacher being beamed into their homes. And we have poor young people who don't have parents who can homeschool them, who don't have the technology, who don't have an iPad or whatever else they're using, who don't have access to broadband, who are going to fall even further behind. So it's not just in terms of the very visible difference on the front line in terms of ethnicity and why this is hitting those communities harder. It's also in terms of education. It's in terms of policy and power. And I think one thing that's really, really striking about this, and this is something that, as someone who grew up in a working class household, every time I'm in policy meetings, the people who are there making policy are the middle class educated people who don't have the lived experience of a lot of the situations that they're talking about. So in terms of universal credit, for example, setting up payment systems that are monthly seemed absolutely natural to policymakers, because obviously you get paid monthly, you get paid a salary. And that is just one example, because so many people don't get paid monthly, get paid weekly or 2 weekly. And so millions of people fell into debt when they had to wait 5 weeks for their first universal credit payment. Now, one of the things about COVID as well is the fact that the power in the government of where to put resources, where to open, we're seeing now in terms of where the money's being distributed, where big business is being supported, but we're also seeing it very, very vividly in the return to work. Those who can return to work, those who are expected to return to work, and those who can't. And again, there are going to be huge problems in terms of legal rights. Can you legally say to your boss you can't come back to work? Can they legally sack you for not coming back to work? And again, we're seeing this divide between the very, very, the more privileged of us who are able to work from home, who are working from offices, and those who have to go back to the front line. And let's not forget that there are people, obviously, who have been working throughout this. The shop workers, the care workers, the transport workers, and these are the people that traditionally we have paid the least. The Equality Trust has always, for a long time, has run their pay tracker, looking at the average FTSE 100 pay in terms of how many times worth of a care worker or a nurse or a teacher or sort of minimum wages. And we know that nurses, teachers are valued, if we reflect this as value, at less than 1% of a FTSE 100 CEO. Now, in the present situation, I know who I'd rather be giving my money to. But just what I would like to move on to now is really how how we can fight back, because a lot of the things I've been saying, you know, you can see more about on our website or in other areas. But one of the things I'd like to say is that inequality has never been more starkly in front of us as it is now. And inequality is a matter of life and death. It is that important. So it is incumbent upon all of us to do something. And the Equality Trust has local groups. We have a large London group, and we have groups across the country and Scotland and Wales. But we also have manifestos. So we'll have a manifesto for what we want the government to do, what we want local councils to do, but also what individuals can do. And that comes back to Ben's point about joining a union if you can, because they are one of the key drivers of income equalitatively bargaining, and we have collective bargaining. You can join our campaigns, but I think one of the most important things to realise is that it is about word of mouth. It's about talking to people. It's about having those discussions. It's about eliciting people's experience, because we have to make this relevant to everyday people. We have to make this relevant to everybody. And I don't know if anybody remembers an animation a while ago, which was Timothy Spall talking to somebody in a pub. And the guy said, "Oh, I don't want to talk about politics." And he starts talking about the hospital. And he says, "Ah, that's politics." So he starts talking about education. That's politics. And making people realise that every aspect of their life is relevant, and that the things that they're experiencing now are the things that they need to be talking to other people about, so that we can have that collective spirit. We don't want to lose that collectivism that we're seeing build now. But I fear sometimes that we're in danger of going back to the old normal that was so bad for most of us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fonda. Before we break out, I wonder about how you see the sort of big political dynamics in terms of the current situation. So there seem to be two elements that maybe add a different sort of possibilities. One is, it seems that the government has been forced to talk to the unions quite a lot about the return, etc., and which, you know, they seem to have had more input than maybe normally. The other thing is, I wondered, in terms of the blue wall of voters that the current government was, certainly before COVID-19, seeking to level up and so on. Do you know how they've been affected, and how that might impact, do you think, how this government plays things moving forward?
I think it's very difficult to make, I'll take the blue wall first. I think it's very difficult to make assumptions about the blue wall MPs. And I think it's quite dangerous to think that just because they're northern, and I say this as a northerner myself, that they're going to have a different set of priorities than southern MPs or southern Tories. I think, you know, we need to look at them as individuals, and I think most of us are still feeling our way in that relatively new intake. I think undoubtedly, when they're looking at how they need to keep their seats and to react to what their constituents want, then it will be very interesting over the next couple of years to see. And what we're doing is speaking to the new intake and gauging, you know, where they stand on inequality, what they feel that they need to do about these issues, and to look at whether they have support for the socio-economic duty, for example, and to see where they stand. So to get a sort of gauge on where they are and what their version of levelling up is. Because I think, again, you know, it's a term that we can almost pin anything onto at the moment. And there's going to be lots of competition for resources. We've already seen sort of leaked plans of, as you mentioned, sort of austerity Mark II. And I think anyone suggesting that public servants and nurses in particular at the moment are going to have a pay freeze for the next couple of years is in pretty dangerous territory. In terms of trade unions, I think, you know, it has been difficult in terms of collective bargaining. It's very difficult to bargain collectively when you have such a dispersed membership. And I think the trend in unions towards becoming bigger and merging that we've seen over the last couple of decades has had some impact. I think in some terms, you know, they are stronger. If you look at Unison, Unite, GMB, they are bigger, therefore stronger in a sense, but not necessarily as sectoral as they were before. The fact that they're talking to government, I think, is good. I do think, you know, that health and safety reps in particular have a huge part to play. And I think the unions really are standing strong at saying, you know, we will not let workers go back unless they're going back into a safe environment. And I think what people are, the thing that I almost want to sort of tattoo on people's head in a sense at the moment is employers' duty of care. Employers have a duty of care. But I think coming back, and again, you know, I'll come back to Deepak's points as well, that it's about enforcement. We can have all the legislation and all the employment rights and other rights in the world, but if they're not being enforced, then they're not worth the paper that they're written on. So I think, you know, there's a key role here for unions, and I'm really pleased to see them step up.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Fonda. I'm going to put everyone again into breakouts for this time shorter 5 minutes, just to give people a chance to reflect amongst themselves on what their experience, what they've read, what they've sort of seen in terms of inequality that they were maybe not aware of, that what do they think has sort of emerged, and how do they see this, whether this could or couldn't lead to change. Welcome back, everyone. Who would like to kick things off? Put your hand up with a comment on inequalities that really jumped out at you during COVID, and whether you think this presents an opportunity or creates an opportunity for change. Olaf.
Presents an opportunity for change as people realize that it's not because of their inability to plan or failure to do things that people who are rich do and therefore are more successful. It's happening to a large majority of people, and I think that's a difference from COVID.
So it's indiscriminate. No one can say, in a sense, it's your fault.
Right. That's my point. Yes.
Thanks. What do you think of that, Vonda?
I think, yeah, it's indiscriminate in terms of anybody can get it. But I think, you know, there was a case of a transport worker called Belly, who was on a concourse at Victoria. She had respiratory problems. She'd asked her employers to give her PPE. They had refused. She was coughed on by somebody who had COVID, her and her companion, and she died. Now, she was a black woman in her, around about the same age as me, in her late 40s, with a child. And her ability to shield herself or protect herself from this is directly related to inequality. You know, if we can isolate and we can stay at home, or we can get in our private jet and go off to somewhere in the middle of the country, then we can protect ourselves. If we've got 5 bathrooms and 4 of us are self-isolating, we can protect ourselves. So even though, you know, it may look like it's indiscriminate, but the exposure to COVID is not necessarily indiscriminate.
I think well, I understood what Olaf was saying was that you know, quite often the people who are not doing very well, it's sort of suggested it's their fault they're not doing very well. Whereas in this situation, you know, like your example, no one can say it was that woman's fault that she got ill and died, but you know, that the differential impact can't be sort of blamed in a sense on the poor.
Yeah, but I think that's a very small part of what's happening, really. I mean, you know, we then get into the arguments about merit and whether, you know, people are there by merit, which, you know, we know if merit is a thing, how come the most intelligent and the best people to do everything tend to be sort of upper middle class white men who are slightly older? You know, it gets into, sorry, Henry. Be pleased to be you. But you know, it is about, we come back to the individualism the atomization of society, of saying, you know, this is somebody's fault because they haven't worked hard enough or they haven't done the right thing, rather than the collective responsibility that we all hold for each other. So I think, in a sense, it's almost, you know, it's a slightly different argument in a sense.
But do you think maybe in the current context there is a sense of collective responsibility emerging?
I think there is, but I think it's still along class lines, where we're seeing mutual aid groups from a lot of people I've been speaking to. You know, the people who live in particular streets are quite happy to do their own street, but they're not necessarily going to go anywhere near the estate at the end of their street. You know, if you're in London and other cities, you will probably be among a lot of different people. So people are still keeping their class sort of distance in a sense, and also it's actually having a bad effect in some ways, because there's a kind of natural tendency in some groups that we've seen for the middle class people who are used to volunteering, used to running things, used to doing things for people, to sort of come along and start organizing, not in a way that's a collective, we can all contribute, but very much from a deficit model of, I'm here, I've got time, I've got resources, I'm going to help you with what I think you need. And so there are, you know, despite this kind of veneer of we're all pulling together, it's a bit like the Blitz, there are some complex issues happening inside this solidarity.
GMR.
Hi, I'm
What's
Jill.
your name? Sorry.
I'd just like to ask Wanda, what business model do you think would be most helpful?
For what? Sorry.
For people, like as a cooperative, best way, or like John Lewis, a partnership, because business, obviously, you know, the flow of money has to happen. So what's the best kind of way of running a business so that people are helped?
Well, I could be really radical here and say that the flow of money doesn't necessarily have to happen. You know, the Native American communities got along just fine without any money. But I recognize that we're in a very different situation to that now. We would advocate cooperatives. We think that, you know, the cooperative model is a far better model. If you look at, I can never remember what that big Spanish collective is. Can't remember, sorry. It may be, I think it may be in the Basque country.
Yeah.
It's in the Basque region, yeah. Apologies to the Basques there. But, you know, their CEO pay ratio has never been more than about 3 to 1. They have a lot of flexibility in the sort of work people want to do. You know, it's run as a part of your life that isn't detracting from your life, because I think for so many of us, coming back to what Ben said, you know, we are exchanging our labor, and some of us are lucky in that we can exchange less of our labor for more comfortable work, in a sense, less of our time. But many people are, you know, working very low paid jobs, two or three jobs, and don't have the time for activism or even to sort of, you know, it's affecting their mental health and other things. So I think having a job with dignity that pays enough for people to live in dignity with the basic things and the security that they need and a security of jobs, I think is the best possible model.
Thanks to Tom and NJ to pointing out the Mondragon.
Mondragon, that's it, yeah.
Who would like to make another comment or raise a question? No, I'll bring in Marilyn.
Okay. I'm just wondering, and this is a genuinely open question, and I'm not terribly optimistic about it, but whether the current situation is, and the fact that one can't help but realise who are the really essential workers, and they're not the CEOs, they are the nurses, the people who empty our bins, the delivery drivers, etc., etc. You know, is that an opportunity to rethink how we value people, not just metaphorically, but in financial terms?
Thanks very much, Marilyn. Ben, I'll bring you in here. What do you think that could make a difference in terms of how we view who should be paid what?
Yeah, I think it's going to affect, you know, like on a lot of what you've heard on the left, at least over the last, like, I don't know, 20 years, you've often heard this kind of hypothetical example put forward when people try and make the case that workers aren't paid according to how, you know, important they are to the economy, but it's actually a reflection of power. You know, pay is a reflection of power rather than productivity. And a lot of people have put forward this hypothetical example where it's like, you know, imagine for a moment what would happen if all of the hedge fund managers in the country weren't allowed to go to work for some reason. You know, what would the impact be? And the kind of, you're supposed to hypothetically think, and you could be like, okay, maybe there might be an economic crisis, but there's also potentially a case to say that actually the world might be a better place. When then, if you ask the question with carers, or you ask the question with let's stick with carers, I think. You know, what would happen if all the people that care for people in our hospitals, in our care homes, in our private homes weren't able to turn up to work? Well, the human impact would be undeniably devastating. And what COVID, I guess, has done is turn this hypothetical example into a reality. So literally on every single essential list of workers for every government across the world, you have had carers, while no private equity manager or hedge fund manager has made it onto a single list of essential workers. Now, that's, I guess, kind of, in a way, that is going to change some of people's perspectives around this. But I do think this isn't going to be enough. You know, at the moment in the UK, let's take this example of carers. At the moment in the UK, a report came out from the Resolution Foundation 2 weeks ago that said that 50% of carers are paid less than the living wage. You know, a huge number of people being paid poverty wages for doing one of the most important jobs in the country. That, I don't think, is going to, you can't shift that. This can be part of, I think, a start of a process of us shifting such an inequality. But I think you need more. And this is why I kind of said unions. I mean, not because I, you know, want to kind of bang an old workerist hat or anything. I think it's partly because when it comes to issues of, you know, I guess like, quote, bread and butter issues that are becoming so important now, you do need like pressure to be implemented on private owners of, let's say, I mean, let's take the issue of care homes. Care homes are now predominantly run by the private sector in this country, and increasingly are being bought up by private equity firms to be run at a profit. Now, in that case, you know, labor struggles become one of the ways in which carers can effectively try and demand higher wages and better conditions at work. But obviously this comes with a problem, yeah? Like if you're a coal miner and you go on strike, coal doesn't care whether you dig it out the ground. If you're a carer and you go on strike, the person you're caring does care about this. And so this is one of the ways in which labor and striking, I think, has changed with the structures and changes in the economy from industry towards services. So this is something we need to think about, but by no means I don't think that this is an impossibility. And Vonda mentioned some of the unions, the smaller unions that are particularly working with these low-paid precarious work and care workers as well. One of them is the International Workers of Great Britain, the IWGB. They have a union of foster care workers. I mean, if you think, what's it like to go on strike as a foster care worker? They don't do kind of traditional labour organising in that way, but they've really heavily lobbied, particularly the Parliament in Scotland, to implement better rights and conditions for foster carers. So it can be done. I think it just has to be done collectively.
Thanks, Ben. Was there someone else had their hand up? GMR, I think you wanted to come back in. Hello.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that when my dad was a young man with 4 children, he had 3 jobs to pay the mortgage when the mortgage rates were 15%. So, you know, hard work is not different to different generations, but it's the rewards that you're not getting at the moment. When he worked for 3 jobs, they got the money to pay the mortgages and things, but now you can work in 3 jobs and still have no decent wage at all.
Thanks. Vonda, what about, do you think we're going to value key workers more. And one thing, although collective bargaining has been sort of the norm for recent history, you look back further, there were actually moves to set wages, weren't there, and to regulate workers, wages, which still happens with agricultural workers in Wales, but I think it's the last place it exists. Is there a potential to actually bring that back?
Well, I think, I mean, as I said before, I worked at an education union, and that was one of the areas up until very recently where there was the STRB, which would set the state teaching rates anyway. Obviously, academies are classed as private schools, so they don't have to adhere to that. And what we saw there was the introduction of performance-related pay. Now, this is just, ludicrous to see how do you performance manage a teacher in that way, in terms of the classes, how they're working across classes, etc. So actually, we've seen a lot of the decimation of those sorts of ways of setting wages. I think it comes back to there is a dissonance between having a minimum wage and having that wage floor and collective bargaining, because obviously in collective bargaining, you don't want to be at the minimum. You want to be bargaining for higher wages for your workers. So I think there is an issue there. But I think it's very difficult in terms of having spot rates in that way, because we know that coming back to the financialisation, the increased financialisation and privatisation of our services means that the private sector is setting the wages. And what the private sector is doing now is moving more towards even spot market rates rather than having bands and banding. So the way that we pay in our pay structures, not to mention gender pay gaps and the rest of it, and equal pay issues are incredibly complex at the moment. But the excuse they use is it's the market. So if they're led by the market, it's very difficult to get to that sort of system.
Thank you, Vonda. Well, we're just about to have to end. So I'm going to ask Vonda and then Ben to give one sort of, I don't know, silver lining. What sort of end up with sort of encouragement and hope, if you like, that for change, or to leave us potentially on a positive note.
I think I'm really looking forward to seeing the Sunday Times Rich List next week, next Sunday. So if people would like to get active and express their feelings about the tastelessness of this at this particular moment in time. But I think it's a realization of key workers. I think it's people realizing that, the value, how we value our key workers, who keeps our society going, who allows the CEOs and the corporates and the profiteers to make their profits. It's off the back of a society that can function, and society only functions when we have our key workers functioning. And I think that has to be one of the biggest lessons that we learn from this.
Thank you very much, Vonda. Ben, your final thought of that could be positive.
Yeah, I think it's got to be the message that, things only change and get better if people actively participate and campaign for stuff and actually make it happen. And it's such a, I mean, I'll give you an example, a positive example from the COVID crisis. So there used to be this, there still is this idea of no recourse to public funds for undocumented migrants. So if you're undocumented or you don't have right to remain in this country, you basically don't have any ability to access state support. And this has just been a barbaric thing that was introduced by Theresa May, I think in 2012, that has just ruined people's lives, created homelessness, has put many, many children and families into destitution. And one of the amazing things, I think, that has a kind of an amazing example of where campaigning works is that a group of organizations, migrant rights support groups, got together and put a legal challenge at the start of the COVID crisis to the High Court to say, this is with a very devastating case of a young boy and what had happened to him. And the High Court has now ruled and no recourse to public funds illegal. So, I guess that's a positive message. One of the harshest things I think was implemented by the previous Tory government is hopefully going to be a thing of the past, and that's out of the campaigning efforts of quite a small group of people. So I think, you know, even with the amount of people on this call, you could do equally something to change, I think, the course of history.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, everyone else. I'd like to say one other thing we haven't discussed, which I think is going to be really interesting, is that now we effectively have a two-tier unemployment benefit system with the continuance of furloughing till October, at least, and probably ongoing. So it's going to be very interesting how that plays out politically, because clearly it is deeply unfair in its impact. But thank you very much for a great discussion. I'd just like to say we do have monthly seminars. Our next one is on the digital economy and competition, as we see the increasing dominance of Amazon and the like. What can we do about it? How's it going to play out in the future? So do join us then. I will be sending an email following up this with a chance for you to give your feedback and also to sign up to our list in touch with our further news. So, and lastly, just to thank Ben and Vonda very much, and all of you for asking great questions and engaging. And I really hope you enjoy it. Thank you and good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.